The morning sun broke through the grey haze over lower Manhattan, casting a pale light across the crowded sidewalks of Canal Street.
Stalls were being set up, carts rolled by, and the city was just beginning to hum with its usual noise. Amid the clatter of early commuters and honking cabs, a fragile figure pushed a rusty cart stacked high with bundles of fresh vegetables. Margaret Maggie Dawson, 68, moved slowly but with purpose. Her back was bent, her hands wrapped tightly around the cold metal handle of the cart. Her faded blue windbreaker barely shielded her from the morning chill, and her gray curls peeked from under a well-worn knit cap. She had been up since 4 a.m., cleaning, tying, and packing the organic produce she grew in a small urban garden in Brooklyn. The farmer's market was her only income. Each bunch of kale or carrots sold meant she could afford her arthritis medication, a warm meal or, just maybe, a little save toward a hope she never voiced aloud, that one day she might find her son. She didn't tell many people about him anymore. 30 years ago, back in Vermont, her life had been torn apart in a fire at the old textile factory where she worked. That day, she had left her 3-year-old son with her sister near the factory housing. When the flames broke out and smoke swallowed the air, the chaos separated families in seconds. By the time Maggie fought her way through the fire line, her sister had collapsed, and the boy was gone. They never found a body, just a small, scorched silver bracelet, his. The police report listed him as missing, presumed dead. But Maggie never stopped believing. She moved to New York to escape the whispers of her old town, but in her heart, she carried his memory every day. Now, pushing her cart across the intersection at Canal and Lafayette, Maggie was lost in thought. A driver, distracted by his phone, didn't notice the light had turned red. A sleek silver Tesla surged forward, screeching to a stop just inches from Maggie's cart. The tires screamed, echoing off the buildings. Maggie startled and stumbled back. The cart tipped. Carrots and radishes bounced across the asphalt. One bunch slammed against the car's front fender, leaving a smudge of dirt on the glossy paint. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped a sharply dressed young man, his face a mask of annoyance. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored blazer and glanced at the mark on his car. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. Maggie instinctively stepped forward, hands raised. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't see."
The man cut her off.
"You didn't see? You were in the middle of the damn road. This car costs more than some apartments." Maggie's face flushed with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to. Please, let me clean that off." Ethan Carter, 33, successful tech entrepreneur, CEO of Arcadyne Innovations, didn't usually lose his temper. But the week had been a mess. His lead developer had quit, a funding round was in jeopardy, and now his brand new Tesla had vegetable grime on it. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "It's fine. Just, be more careful next time." He turned to get back in the car when his eyes caught a flash of silver on Maggie's wrist. A small bracelet, worn with age, glinted under the morning light. Something about it stopped him cold. "Where did you get that?" he asked, pointing at the bracelet. Maggie looked down. Her fingers instinctively closed over it. "This? It belonged to my son. He's been missing for a long time." Ethan stared. The design, interlocking vines around a tiny engraved leaf, was bizarrely familiar. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys. Attached to the ring was a small charm, identical in design. "I had this since I was a kid," he said slowly. "They told me it was found with me at the orphanage." For a moment, neither of them moved.
Maggie's voice trembled. "How old are you?" Tirtitri. She inhaled sharply, eyes glistening.
That was the age her son would have been. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He didn't know what to do with the wave of emotion rising in his chest. "I'm sure it's just a coincidence," he said quickly. Lots of kids had silver bracelets. They were common. "Not this design," Maggie said, lifting her wrist. "My father made it. He was a silversmith. There were only 2 made. One for me. One for him." Ethan stared at the charm in his hand. For years, he had thought nothing of it. Just a strange keepsake from the past. Suddenly, it felt heavier. "I don't know what this means," he said finally.
Maggie blinked, if waking from a dream.
"It might not mean anything. But, may I ask where you were born?" "I don't know," Ethan replied. I was left at Brooklyn Children's Home.
Nos birth certificats. Nos records before age 4.
I was adopted by the Carters when I was 6.
Maggie's leg weekend.
She grabbed the edge of her cart for support. Ethan instinctively reached out, steadying her by the arm. The contact surprised them both. It was brief, but something about it felt oddly natural.
I'm fine, Maggie whispered.
I've waited so long to feel something like this again. Ethan cleared his throat.
Look, he should get going.
But.
Et hésita-t-elle.
Logic screamed at him to walk away. There were a million reasons not to get involved. But some quiet voice inside him, said he couldn't leave it like this. Maybe we could talk more. Get some coffee. Maggie looked up, eyes wide.
You mean it?
He nodded. Just to clear things up. She smiled through tears. Thank you. As they crossed the street together, Ethan kept glancing at the bracelet. The sunlight caught the silver leaf again, and for the first time in years, he felt something shift deep inside. Not certainty, not yet, but the beginning of something he couldn't quite name. A question. A pull.
A hope.
And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. The cafe on Mulberry Street was small, tucked between a laundromat and an old bookstore that still sold paperbacks for 50 cents. It smelled of roasted espresso and vanilla beans, with light jazz humming in the background. Ethan had never been there before. It wasn't the kind of place his colleagues from the startup scene would frequent. But it felt right somehow. They sat near the window. Maggie held her cup of tea with both hands, as if to absorb the warmth through her skin. Her fingers trembled slightly, whether from age or emotion, Ethan couldn't tell. He stirred his coffee, distracted by the bracelet still glinting on her wrist. I didn't mean to startle you earlier, he said after a long silence. I wasn't expecting any of this.
Maggie smiled softly.
Neither was I. There was another pause. The kind that comes not from awkwardness, but from two people trying to make sense of something that didn't yet make sense. Can I see it again? She asked, gesturing toward his keychain. Ethan unclipped it, handing her the small charm. Maggie turned it over in her palm, inspecting the engraving with quiet reverence. My father made these when I was a girl, she said, her voice distant. He wasn't famous or anything.
Just a craftsman.
But he put his whole heart into his work. He gave me one on my 18th birthday and made the other smaller, for when I had a child. She slid the charm across the table. I gave it to my son when he turned 2. He wore it on a tiny chain around his neck. The day of the fire, it was the only thing they found near the wreckage. The chain was broken, but the charm survived. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his brows furrowed. But how would it end up with me?
Maggie made sighs.
That's the question, isn't it? He exhaled. I've never looked too deeply into where I came from. Part of me didn't want to know. I figured it wouldn't change anything. Maybe it wouldn't, she said. But maybe it could explain something. Ethan touched the charm, then looked down at his left hand. You said your son had a scar on his left index finger? She nodded.
A little crescent-shaped one.
He cut it on a broken mason jar when he was trying to help me with the canning. He was always trying to help. Ethan turned his hand over. There it was. A faint, pale line near the knuckle. He had noticed it all his life, but like the charm, it had never seemed significant. Just another forgotten childhood accident. His heart was beating faster now. I don't want to jump to conclusions, he said carefully. I mean, the scar could be coincidence. And maybe there were other charms like this. Maggie didn't argue. I know it's a lot to take in.
I'm not asking you to believe anything today.
But I've spent 30 years waking up every morning wondering if my son was still out there. This is the closest I've ever been to feeling like I might find out. Ethan rubbed his temple.
Do you remember anything else?
Anything that might help confirm it. Maggie closed her eyes, as if searching through a dusty attic of memories. He had a little stuffed rabbit he carried everywhere. Its ear was chewed up because the dog got to it once. And he used to hum when he was nervous. Not a song, just this little tune he made up. He'd do it at the doctor's office, or when he thought he was in trouble.
Ethan blinked.
I do that, he said quietly.
The humming thing.
I still do it sometimes. I thought it was just a quirk. They stared at each other for a long moment. Not with certainty. Not with answers. But with something closer to recognition. Maggie reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. She slid it across the table. It was old, the colors faded. A younger Maggie stood in front of a white picket fence, holding a chubby little boy in overalls. His hair was thick and dark. He was laughing, arms stretched out toward the camera. Ethan picked up the photo slowly. His hands shook. "I've seen this fence," he whispered. Maggie leaned in. "What do you mean?"
I don't know.
"It's just familiar. I used to have dreams as a kid.
A fence like this. And a woman singing in the kitchen.
But every time I tried to see her face, I'd wake up."
Maggie's lips parted, her breath catching.
"I used to sing to him every night," she said.
A lullaby my mother taught me.
He'd fall asleep in my lap, even when he got too big. Ethan sat back, rubbing the back of his neck. The cafe had grown quieter, or maybe the world outside had faded. It felt like the air between them had thickened, filled with pieces of a puzzle neither of them had known existed. "I don't want to get your hopes up," he said gently. "It could all be coincidence. Maybe it's just similar memories."
Maybe I'm not. You don't have to be, Maggie interrupted softly.
"Not unless you want to know." He looked at her tired eyes, her fragile hands, her patient smile. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the successful entrepreneur, or the adopted son of a wealthy family, or the brand everyone else expected him to be. He just felt like someone searching. "Maybe we should find out," he said at last. "You mean?" "A DNA test. Just to be sure." Maggie nodded slowly, blinking back tears. "I would like that very much." They stood together, awkwardly at first. Ethan helped her with her coat, then picked up her small cart. Outside, the city moved on without them, taxis blaring, sirens wailing, tourists laughing over bagels. But something fundamental had shifted.
Somewhere beneath the layer of logic and do, two hearts had quietly taken a step closer.
As they walked side by side toward the nearby clinic, Ethan felt that old humming start up in his throat. Soft. Barely audible. Maggie turned, eyes wide. "You still do it," she whispered. He didn't respond. Just smiled faintly. Neither of them said anything more. They didn't have to. The walk to the DNA testing clinic was quiet. Ethan and Maggie said little as they moved down the street, surrounded by the clamor of the city. The morning had grown warmer, but the air between them carried a kind of tension, half hope, half fear. For Maggie, it was the possibility of closure to 3 decades of waiting. For Ethan, it was the uncertainty of a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The clinic was located in a modest building near Union Square, wedged between a dry cleaner and a nail salon. Inside, it was sterile and quiet, the air thick with antiseptic and faint piano music playing through hidden speakers. A woman at the reception desk handed them forms with a practiced smile, as if this moment wasn't quietly life-altering for the two people before her. They filled out the paperwork in silence. Names. Dates. Known histories. Unknowns. Ethan paused when he reached the section for biological parents. He left it blank. When the nurse called them in, they followed her into a small exam room where a technician explained the process. It was simple. Cheek swabs from both of them, no pain, results expected within 7 business days. As the swabs were collected and sealed in labeled containers, Maggie's hands folded tightly in her lap. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. When it was done, they stepped outside. The sun had risen fully now, casting long, sharp shadows on the pavement. "Well," Ethan said, glancing at the sky, "now we wait." Maggie gave him a small nod. "Thank you for doing this. I know you didn't have to."
He shrugged.
"I want to know too. I've always said it didn't matter where I came from, but maybe that wasn't true." They parted ways outside the clinic. Maggie had to get back to the market. Ethan returned to his office, but the city felt different now. The buzz of ambition, the endless tasks and meetings, everything seemed muted. That night, instead of heading to the usual tech meetup or grabbing dinner with colleagues, Ethan pulled a box from the back of his closet. Inside were mementos from his childhood, photos from his teenage years, a tattered backpack from elementary school, and a folder of paperwork from the Brooklyn Children's Home. He opened it slowly. The papers were yellowed and photocopied. The orphanage had closed down 15 years ago amid controversy. There had been reports of disorganized records, misplacement of children, and unfit caregivers. Ethan's file was thin, a name assigned at the home, an approximate age, and a date he had arrived. July 8, 1994. He sat back. The factory fire Maggie had described took place on June 30, 1994, in a small town in Vermont. He looked it up online and found an archived local newspaper article. The headline read, "Textile Factory Blaze Claims 3 Lives, Several Missing."
One paragraph stood out.
A 3-year-old boy, identified only as Jamie, is believed to have gone missing during the chaos. His aunt was found unconscious at the scene, and efforts to locate the child were unsuccessful. The only recovered item was a small silver bracelet found near the west exit.
Jamie.
That was the name Maggie had whispered when she looked at the charm. He stared at the article for a long time. It felt like a ghost reaching out from the past. The timeline matched. The bracelet matched. The scar.
Zooming.
The dreams. But what if he was wrong? What if it was all coincidence? His phone buzzed. A message from his mother, his adoptive one, asking if he was coming for dinner on Sunday. He hesitated before replying with a simple yes. He hadn't told them about Maggie. Not yet. He didn't know how to. The next day, Ethan took a taxi out to the old orphanage building in Brooklyn. The structure was boarded up, with graffiti marking the side walls and weeds poking through cracks in the sidewalk. It had been condemned for years. But across the street, there was a small cafe where a few elderly patrons lingered near the window. He walked in and ordered coffee, then turned to the woman behind the counter. She was in her 60s, with kind eyes and a cautious smile. "This may sound strange," he began, "but I'm trying to find out more about the Brooklyn Children's Home. I grew up there." Her expression shifted. "Oh, I remember that place. My sister used to volunteer there on weekends."
Ethan's Pulse Weekend.
Would she remember anything? This was back in the 90s. "She might," the woman said. "Wait here." She disappeared into the back and returned a few minutes later with an older woman wearing a cardigan and a faded name tag that read Ruth. Ruth looked him over carefully. "You're one of the kids?" "I think so," Ethan said. "I was adopted in 96. I'm trying to learn more about who I was before." Ruth sat down across from him. Records were a mess back then. After the director left, everything fell apart. "We tried to help the kids as best we could, but..." She trailed off, her eyes distant. "Do you remember a boy being brought in during July 94? He asked. "No name, just dropped off?" Ruth's brow furrowed. "There were a few like that. But I do remember one.
A little boy.
Quiet. Barely spoke at first. He had a silver bracelet, I think. The director logged it, but he never wore it again after the first week."
Ethan leaned forward.
"Do you remember what happened to him?"
Ruth shook her head.
"He got adopted quickly. Some wealthy couple from Westchester. I think they changed his name. Nice people. The boy, he seemed happy eventually." Ethan swallowed. "That might have been me." Ruth reached out and gently touched his hand. "If you're looking for where you came from, I hope you find it. But I want you to remember something, you matter to people. Even then. Even if they didn't know how to show it." He nodded, overwhelmed. That night, he called Maggie. "I talked to someone," he said.
From the orphanage.
She remembered a boy with a silver bracelet being brought in during the exact week of the fire. She thinks he was adopted by a couple from Westchester. Maggie was silent for a long moment. Then, "That's you, isn't it?" "I don't know yet. But I think so."
She exhaled.
"I never dared to believe I'd get this far." "Neither did I." "Do you want to come by tomorrow?" she asked. "I'll make dinner.
Something simple.
My mama's recipe." "I'd like that," Ethan said. "Very much." As he hung up, he realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was looking forward to a home-cooked meal, not for the food, but for what it represented. The possibility of belonging.
The beginning of something true.
Maggie had spent the whole day preparing a meal she hadn't cooked in nearly a decade. It wasn't extravagant, just roasted chicken with rosemary, mashed potatoes, and a small apple pie cooling on the windowsill. But it was the meal she used to make on Sundays, back when her son was little and life was simpler. Back when hope hadn't been reduced to whispers and silent prayers. The apartment was spotless. Maggie had scrubbed every corner, rearranged the framed photos on the wall, even laid out fresh flowers on the small dining table near the window. She checked the time again. 6:17 p.m. Ethan had said he'd arrive around 6:30. Her heart thudded with every passing minute. When the knock finally came, she opened the door to find him standing there, holding a bottle of sparkling water and looking slightly nervous. "I didn't know what to bring," he said. "I figured wine might be too formal." Maggie smiled, her hands trembling slightly as she took the bottle.
"This is perfect. Come in, come in."
He stepped inside, his eyes sweeping over the modest apartment. It was warm and filled with the scent of baked apples and rosemary. On a shelf near the hallway sat an old photo of a young boy in overalls, Jamie, and a younger Maggie, arms wrapped around him. Ethan paused for a moment, gazing at it. The familiarity of the scene tugged at something inside him. They sat for dinner, and for a while, the conversation was light. Maggie asked about his work, and Ethan spoke about the chaos of running a startup. He asked about her garden in Brooklyn, and she explained how she'd turned a small community plot into a modest source of income. But underneath it all, the question loomed, what if the test said no? When the dishes were cleared and the pie half-eaten, Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. "They emailed me the results this morning," he said quietly. "I printed them out."
Maggie briscoqued.
Her hands, which had been steadily folding a napkin in her lap, stilled. "I thought we'd read them together," he added. She nodded slowly. Ethan broke the seal carefully, unfolding the single sheet of paper. His eyes scanned the text quickly, then slowly again. He didn't say anything.
Maggie leaned forward.
"What does it say?" Ethan looked up, his expression unreadable. "It says, the DNA is not a match."
Silence.
A long, aching silence that pressed into the room like a fog. Maggie blinked once, twice, as if trying to process the words. Her eyes fell to the table, then to the paper in his hands. "No match," she whispered. Ethan set the page down gently. "I'm sorry." She sat back, her shoulders trembling slightly. One hand rose to cover her mouth. Her eyes welled up, and a soft, strangled sound escaped her throat, a quiet sob, almost like a gasp. "I shouldn't have hoped," she said. "It was foolish." "It wasn't," Ethan replied, his voice low. "You had every reason to hope." She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks.
30 years, Ethan.
"I've lived 30 years thinking that maybe he was still out there. And for a moment, I let myself believe it was you." He reached across the table and gently placed his hand over hers. "You weren't the only one who believed." Maggie looked at him, her face lined with grief. "But it's not real. You're not him." "No," he said. "I'm not. But I don't think that means any of this was a mistake." Her lips trembled. "You don't have to say that."
You don't owe me anything. Ethan leaned forward.
"Maybe I don't. But I feel like
you want to be here."
"Not because of the test. Because of what I've felt since we met." Maggie stared at him for a long moment, as if searching his face for a reason to believe. Then she exhaled, the breath shaky and slow. "Sometimes," she whispered, "we don't get the ending we dreamed of. But maybe, we still find something else."
Something juste réel.
They sat in silence again, this time less painful, more contemplative. Later that evening, Ethan helped wash the dishes. Maggie watched him from the kitchen table, the sting of disappointment still fresh, but softened by something else, an unexpected kind of peace. The boy she lost was still gone. But the emptiness he left behind no longer felt so unbearable. When Ethan was ready to leave, Maggie walked him to the door. "I know this probably sounds strange," she said, "but would you come by again? Not because of who you might be. Just because I like having you here." He smiled.
"Idée like that."
As he stepped into the hallway, she added, "You'll always be welcome here, Ethan. Whatever the DNA says." He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, the idea of home felt less like a place, and more like a person. He left the building and walked into the night, the cool air brushing against his skin. He felt something tugging at him, not grief, not loss, but a curious warmth. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't biology. It wasn't certainty. It was just her. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to the photo he'd taken of Maggie and Jamie earlier. The smiles.
The small-an. The silver bracelet.
He didn't know what came next. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had to know. He just had to keep walking toward it. The Cotter family home in Westchester had always been pristine. White-trimmed windows, a manicured lawn, a cobblestone driveway, and the kind of silence that spoke of old money and carefully preserved order. Ethan had spent the majority of his teenage years there, attending private schools, learning manners over dinner, and being reminded, gently but firmly, how fortunate he was to be given a second chance. He stood now at the front door hesitant, holding the same envelope that had unraveled so many threads just days earlier. The result, printed in black and white, had told him that Maggie Dawson wasn't his biological mother. But it hadn't closed the chapter. If anything, it had cracked open another, one involving the family that raised him, and the questions he'd never dared ask until now. His mother opened the door before he could knock. "Ethan," she said with a bright, practiced smile. "You didn't say what time you'd be coming. Come in, I've just finished setting the table." He followed her into the dining room. His father was already seated, a glass of red wine in hand, flipping through the Wall Street Journal. The room smelled of roast lamb and thyme. It was familiar, polished, and suddenly, somehow, too clean. "Good to see you, son," his father said without looking up.
How's business?
"Busy," Ethan replied, taking his seat. "But that's not why I came." His mother paused as she began to pour him a glass of water.
Something wrong?
"I've been looking into my past," he said. "Where I came from. Before I was adopted." His father looked up. Slowly. Eyes narrowing, ever so slightly. "I met someone," Ethan continued. "A woman who believes I might be her son. There were a lot of coincidences.
Matching details.
We took a DNA test." His mother sat down, the pitcher of water forgotten in her hand. "Why would you do that?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated. "Because I needed to know. Because I've always needed to know, even if I pretended I didn't."
There was silence.
Then his father set down his glass.
Let me guess.
"It didn't match." "No, it didn't," Ethan said. "But that's not the point." "What is the point then?" his father asked, his tone carefully neutral. Ethan looked between them. "The point is, I realized I never asked either of you about what happened before I came here. Who found me? What you were told." His mother's eyes glistened. "We didn't think it mattered. We wanted to give you a life that would help you forget the parts that hurt."
Ethan leaned forward.
"But they didn't go away. I still had questions. I still dreamed of a white fence and someone singing in the kitchen. I still kept that charm you found with me." His father folded his hands.
Ethan, we gave you everything.
Education. Security. A future. Are you saying that wasn't enough? "I'm not ungrateful," Ethan said quickly. "I'm just trying to understand who I am. It's not about replacing you. It's about connecting the dots." His mother finally spoke. "Who is she? This woman?" "Her name is Maggie Dawson," he said.
She lives in Brooklyn.
"She's kind, gentle, and she's been looking for her son for 30 years. "And now you want to bring her into our lives?" his father asked, voice harder now. "Parade her around like a second mother? That's not what I'm doing." "Do you realize what this could do to your reputation?" his father continued.
You're a public figure now.
A CEO. A face of leadership. You can't be seen chasing ghost stories from your childhood. Especially not with some elderly woman who sells vegetables on the street. Ethan's hands clenched under the table.
She's not a ghost story.
And she deserves more respect than that. "Son," his mother said gently, "we just want what's best for you.
We've always protected you."
That hasn't changed. Ethan looked at them, two people who had clothed him, educated him, loved him in their own measured way. But he also saw the lines between love and control. between care and fear. They wanted to protect him, yes. But they also wanted to protect the life they had built around him. "I'm not asking for permission," he said softly. "I just thought you deserved to know." His father shook his head. "If you bring her into your life, it will only cause confusion. For you. For us.
For your public image.
Do you really want to explain this to shareholders? To investors?" "I don't care what they think," Ethan said, rising from his chair. "Then maybe you're not the man we raised," his father said coldly. His mother gasped. "Stephen." "No," Ethan said, voice calm but firm. "Maybe I'm finally becoming the man I was supposed to be." He turned and walked out of the dining room, his steps steady. As he reached the front door, his mother followed him. "Ethan," she said, voice breaking. "You'll always be our son. But please, don't let this woman take you from us." He turned to face her. "She's not taking me from anyone. She's just reminding me that there's more to life than image and legacy." He left the house with the envelope still tucked under his arm, though he no longer needed it. The results had become irrelevant. What mattered was what he felt when he was with Maggie: comfort, connection, something unspoken that no blood test could measure. Back in the city, he found himself walking past the cafe where they had first talked. The chair she had sat in was empty now.
The light inside was warm.
Inviting. He pulled out his phone and sent a message.
"Ethan, are you free tomorrow?"
"I'd like to see you." The reply came a few minutes later.
"Maggie, always. Come by anytime, sweetheart."
He smiled faintly.
Sweetheart.
No one had called him that since he was a child. He kept walking, phone in hand, the city stretching out before him. He didn't know what would come next, how his adoptive parents would respond long-term, how the world would perceive his connection with Maggie, or even how he'd explain it to himself. But he did know one thing. The people who love you don't always come in expected forms. And the families we build can be stronger than the ones we're born into. Sometimes, all it takes is a moment of recognition. A spark. A scar. A charm. And suddenly, the world tilts.
And everything begins again.
Maggie wasn't expecting visitors that morning. She had just finished watering the few potted herbs on her windowsill when there was a knock at the door. At first, she assumed it might be Ethan, perhaps stopping by earlier than usual. Her heart always skipped a little whenever she thought of him now. But when she opened the door, it wasn't Ethan standing in the hallway. It was a man in his early 70s, tall and slightly stooped, with thick white hair and eyes so familiar it made her freeze. "Hello, Maggie," he said, his voice low and cautious. "It's been a long time." She stared at him, hand still on the doorknob.
"David."
He nodded. "It's me." She stepped aside without a word, and he entered the small apartment as if no time had passed at all, though it had been nearly 3 decades. They hadn't spoken since the aftermath of the fire, since the night everything fell apart. Since the night Jamie disappeared. David looked around the room quietly. The faint scent of lavender filled the air. The same kind of scent their mother used to keep in the house back in Vermont. Some things never left a person. "I thought you moved back out west," Maggie said, finally finding her voice. "I did," he replied. "But I was passing through New York. And I heard something." She narrowed her eyes. "From who?"
"En Franc-Offieur. Margaret from the church."
"She said you'd met a young man. That you thought he might be Jamie."
Maggie sank into the armchair.
Her hands trembled slightly. "His name is Ethan. He's not Jamie. We did the DNA test. It didn't match." David sat across from her, slowly. "I see." She looked up at him. "Why are you here?"
Et hésita-t-elle.
"Because there's something I never told you. Something I probably should have said years ago." She stiffened. "Go on." David exhaled and rubbed his face with both hands before beginning. "The night of the fire," he said, "you know I was away. But I came back the next morning as soon as I heard. I went to the site, I talked to the responders, the neighbors, everyone. And someone told me they saw a little boy wandering down the main road about an hour after the blaze started. Alone. Crying. Covered in ash."
Maggie's eyes widened.
"I tried to find out more, but the town was chaos. No one could say where the boy had gone. I filed a missing child report with a few stations farther south, just in case. A week later, a call came in. A child had been found wandering in a rest stop parking lot in Connecticut. No ID.
No name.
Just a bracelet. Her breath caught. You didn't tell me this? David looked away. By the time I got there, he was already in the system. Placed in temporary care. And the woman in charge said another family had already shown interest in adopting him. A wealthy couple from New York. I asked about the bracelet, and she said it matched what you described. But Maggie. I panicked. I wasn't sure if it was him. I'd lost so much already. I didn't want to give you false hope. She stared at him, stunned. You let them take him? I thought maybe it was better that way. That maybe he'd have a better life. She stood abruptly, her voice rising. You had no right. You should have told me. I know, David said quietly. And I've lived with that regret every single day. Tears welled in her eyes.
Tirtilleuse, David.
I mourned him. I dreamed of him. And you. I thought I was protecting you, he said. I was wrong. The room fell into a heavy silence. Maggie sank back down, her hands clutching the armrests like she was holding on to the earth itself. Do you think it was him? She asked, her voice barely audible. David nodded. I do. I can't be sure, but the timing, the bracelet, the description, it all fits. She sat motionless for a long time. Then, I thought Ethan was him. Everything about him felt right. But the test said no.
David leaned forward.
What if the system made a mistake? What if his identity got mixed up? You said he had no birth certificate.
No early record.
What if he's Jamie, but they changed his file? Gave him a new name, new details to match the adoptive parents.
Maggie S. Brisicht.
Could that happen? David nodded slowly. Back then, it wasn't impossible. Especially if paperwork was missing. The orphanage system wasn't exactly airtight. Maggie looked toward the window, her eyes distant. He said he always wondered where he came from. That he had dreams about a white fence and someone singing. David's voice softened.
You used to sing to Jamie every night. A bit of silence.
Then Maggie whispered, I want to know the truth. David stood. Then let's find it. Together. Later that day, Maggie called Ethan. I need to tell you something, she said over the phone.
Can you come by?
He heard the tremble in her voice and said yes without hesitation. When he arrived, Maggie introduced him to David. They shook hands cautiously, two strangers tied by something they didn't yet understand. Ethan sat on the couch while Maggie recounted the entire story. David's confession, the boy found in Connecticut, the bracelet, the possible misidentification.
Ethan listened without interruption.
When she finished, he leaned back, stunned. You're saying?
He might still be Jamie.
It's possible, David said. There's no proof yet. But the more we dig, the more it looks that way.
Ethan's mind spun.
But the DNA test? Maggie nodded. Could have been flawed. Or compared to the wrong database.
Or maybe something got lost between the paperwork and the science.
I don't know. But I know what I feel when I see you. I know what I've felt since the first day. Ethan looked down at his hands. He thought about the charm. The scar. The dreams.
The humming. The inexplicable pull toward this woman.
He looked up. Then let's find out.
For real this time. Maggie exhaled, a brise d'être carrier tirtilleurs of longing.
David placed a hand gently on her shoulder. I don't know where this will lead, Ethan said, but I'm not walking away. And for the first time since the test results arrived, Maggie smiled, not out of hope or grief, but resolve. She hadn't come to the end of a road. She had just found the next path.
Ethan Carter sat in the sleek glass office of Arcadine Innovation, staring at the skyline of Manhattan beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows.
The city pulsed with energy, its heartbeat in sync with the companies that tried to define the future. For years, Ethan had thrived in this world: tech conferences, TED Talks, brand partnerships, investor dinners. His name was synonymous with modern leadership, intelligent, poised, visionary. But that version of him felt increasingly distant now. He hadn't told his PR team about Maggie.
Not in detail.
He had carefully kept their meetings private, only confiding in a few close friends. The visit from David, the possibility that the DNA test had been wrong, and that he might still be Jamie, none of it had reached the public. Until now. It began with a photo. A freelance blogger had taken it from across the street, Ethan walking beside Maggie, his hand gently supporting her elbow as they crossed a busy intersection in Brooklyn. Maggie was carrying her market bag, and Ethan had been laughing at something she'd said. It was innocent, almost sweet. But once the photo hit social media, the commentary erupted.
Is this Ethan Carter's secret modeur?
Startup CEO spotted with elderly woman in Brooklyn. What's the story?
Is blood ticker en image?
Within 24 hours, his assistant forwarded over a half-dozen interview requests. Tech news outlets speculated on his origins.
Gossip page spun tales of a secret family.
Investors asked whether Ethan's personal distraction would affect upcoming product launches. Arcadine's board requested an emergency image strategy meeting. Now, Ethan found himself in that meeting. The company's head of PR, Melissa Grant, sat at the end of the table, her tablet in hand, expression cool and professional. "We have a potential issue," she said, tapping the screen to project the now viral photo onto the wall behind her. The image has been shared over 300,000 times. The story is being picked up by mainstream media. Right now, it's mostly speculation. But if we don't get ahead of it, we lose control of the narrative. Ethan leaned back in his chair. And what narrative would we like to control? Melissa exchanged a glance with the board chair, then said, "There are a few options. One is to clarify that this woman is someone you're helping philanthropically, low income, elder support. That gives you a humanitarian edge." Or? Ethan asked, his tone already colder. Or, she continued, "We maintain that it's a private family matter, unconfirmed, and move attention back to the upcoming launch." Ethan looked at the photo. He remembered that day. Maggie had made a joke about how his shoes probably cost more than her entire grocery cart. He had laughed, not because it was true, but because she had a way of saying things that cut through the artificial. "This isn't a PR problem," he said.
"This is my life."
Melissa's voice softened. "Ethan, you've built a brand around clarity, confidence, and innovation. Investors buy into you as much as the product. If this situation becomes messy, if it calls into question your background, your stability, it could cause serious complications." "I didn't ask for any of this to become public," he said. "But it is," she replied. "And we need to decide, who is she to you?" The question echoed. Who was Maggie Dawson to him? She wasn't his confirmed biological mother, at least not yet. But she was the woman who had welcomed him into her home, who remembered how he hummed when nervous, who made dinner for him like he was someone worth cooking for. She was the first person in years who made him feel grounded. "I'm not going to pretend she's just someone I'm helping," Ethan said quietly.
"She means something to me." Melissa blinked.
"Then we should prepare a statement. A controlled narrative." "No," he said.
"I'll speak for myself."
Later that evening, he sat in his apartment, phone in hand, staring at the social media storm that still hadn't died down. He typed out a simple post. "I met someone who reminded me that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes, it's about history. About memory. About instinct. I don't know what the tests say. But I know what my heart does." He didn't consult his PR team. He didn't run it past a legal advisor. He posted it. Within minutes, the post had thousands of likes. Hundreds of comments poured in, some supportive, others cynical. Why would a millionaire tech CEO be hanging around with a street vendor? This is clearly for publicity. This is the kind of vulnerability we need more of. She looks like my grandma. This made me cry.
And then, another unexpected development.
A message request from a woman named Janine, who claimed to have worked in the Connecticut Child Welfare Office in the 1990s. Her message was brief, but urgent.
"I remember the boy with the bracelet.
I've kept notes. I think I can help.
Ethan's pulse quickened."
He screenshotted the message and sent it to Maggie. 10 minutes later, her reply came. "Come over.
Let's read it together."
When he arrived, Maggie was already sitting at the kitchen table, her glasses perched on her nose, a printout of the message in front of her. She looked up at him with a mix of fear and anticipation. "Do you think this is real?" she asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I want to find out." She reached across the table and took his hand. "They're already talking about us, you know," she said. "I saw the articles."
I don't care. You should.
"You've worked hard to build something." "I've worked hard," he said, "but I don't know if I ever built anything real."
Not until now.
Maggie smiled faintly. He added, "They asked me who you are. For a statement. A narrative. Something clean and marketable." "And what did you say?" "I told them I didn't care what the DNA said. I told them what my heart knew." Maggie's eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. Not this time. Outside, the city buzzed on. But in that small apartment in Brooklyn, something quiet and real held the air steady. Ethan opened his laptop and began typing a reply to Janine. There were more answers to seek, more stories to uncover. But he knew now that even if the search never gave him certainty, he had already found something he never expected. He had found someone who chose him, not for his title, his money, or his past, but for the way he looked when he listened, for the way he hummed without realizing, for the way he wanted to belong. And sometimes, that was enough. The morning of the Arcadine summit arrived under a sky the color of slate. Heavy clouds loomed over the skyline, casting sharp angles of light across the wide marble lobby of the Intercontinental Hotel, where guests in tailored suits gathered for the company's biggest annual event. Cameras were already stationed, livestream banners projected on LED screens, and in just a few hours, Ethan Carter would take the stage as the keynote speaker. It was supposed to be a celebration of the company's newest product line, a moment of triumph after months of development. But no one in the PR team was talking about the tech anymore. They were talking about Maggie. About the photo. About the post. About the message from Janine, which Ethan still hadn't shared publicly, because he wasn't sure what it meant, not yet. But it confirmed at least one thing: there were gaps in the original adoption records. Enough, perhaps, to suggest that what he believed to be true for most of his life might have been constructed out of a system's failure. Or someone's choice. Melissa met him in the green room, a slim tablet clutched in one hand and her brow furrowed deeply. "The investors are nervous," she said.
They're chatté from the Wall Street Review.
"Some are saying you've been emotionally compromised." Ethan nodded. He didn't argue. "We could shift the narrative back to innovation," she suggested. "Stick to the script. Focus on Arcadine's achievements. The humanitarian angle, your work with community tech centers, still plays well." He sat in silence. Finally, he said, "What if I don't want to stick to the script?"
Melissa exhaled slowly.
"Ethan, this isn't just your story anymore. You have a company, employees, a brand that people trust."
One wrong turn, and we lose control.
He looked up. Maybe it was never really about control. She opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. At 10:03 a.m., Ethan stepped onto the stage. The room was a sea of faces and cameras. Some watched through devices, others leaned in from rows of perfectly aligned chairs. His image was projected behind him, larger than life, flanked by corporate slogans and the sharp blue Arcadine logo. He stood at the center, adjusted the microphone, and looked out, not at the cameras, but at the people. "I was supposed to talk to you today about innovation," he began. "About our new line of consumer AI, and how Arcadine continues to reshape the relationship between humans and technology." There was a polite ripple of applause. "But I've learned something recently," he continued, "about how we talk about truth." The room stilled. Technology is built on data, on logic. But people live in the in-between.
We live in the gray area.
We live with doubt, memory, longing. We live with stories we don't always understand. Melissa, from the side of the stage, shifted nervously. Ethan went on, voice steady but quieter now. "Recently, a photo surfaced of me with a woman named Maggie Dawson. Some called her a stranger. Others called her a scandal. Some asked why I was spending time with a street vendor when I should be sitting in a boardroom." He paused. "I didn't respond to those comments. Because I was trying to figure out what she meant to me. Whether she was part of my past, or just someone I had found by chance."
Allons Brice.
But now I realize, the truth isn't just about who shares your blood. Sometimes, the people who show up and choose to love you, without title, without obligation, become your truest family. The room was silent. There's still a lot I don't know, he admitted. I don't know what happened 30 years ago. I don't know if the name I carry was ever mine to begin with. I don't know why the system failed. But I do know that hiding behind silence doesn't fix anything. He looked toward the camera now. Straight into the lens.
So here's what I don't know.
Maggie Dawson lost her son in a fire 3 decades ago. She never stopped searching. I don't know if I'm him. But when I sit across from her, I feel something that no DNA test can define. And I believe in honoring that. A pause. A breath. I also believe that companies, like people, need to own their stories.
Even the uncertain ones.
Especially those. He stepped back from the microphone. I won't be answering questions today. Not about tech. Not about family. Today, I just wanted to tell you the truth.
I know it now.
With that, he walked off stage. Behind him, the applause was hesitant at first, then louder, growing into a full sustained standing ovation. It wasn't for a product. It wasn't for performance. It was for the moment a CEO chose to speak like a person. Backstage, Melissa approached him. You just made every headline in the country, she said. I know. You also made half the board panic. Probably.
En the other half cry.
He turned to her.
What about you?
Melissa smiled faintly. I think I just became your PR manager for the most unpredictable chapter of your life. That night, Maggie watched the broadcast on a small screen in her apartment. She sat on the couch, clutching a pillow, tears streaking her cheeks. He hadn't said her name for credit. He hadn't turned her into a narrative device. He had honored her. And more importantly, he had honored himself. The phone rang. It was Ethan. I meant every word, he said. I know, she whispered. There's something else, he added. I heard back from Janine. She still has original intake records. Names, timestamps, case numbers. She says there's a chance the paperwork was switched. That a child from the fire was accidentally registered under a different name. Maggie sat up straighter. We're going to meet her. Tomorrow. And in that moment, 30 years of searching no longer felt endless. They felt like steps. Forward. Together. Janine's house was tucked away on a quiet cul-de-sac in a small Connecticut town where the roads curved gently and the trees still whispered of older decades. The modest one-story home had a white porch, faded shutters, and a garden that looked like it had once been loved deeply, even if time had loosened its edges. When Ethan and Maggie pulled into the driveway, Janine was already waiting at the door. She was in her early 70s, small-framed, with gray hair pulled back into a clip and eyes sharp with a kind of clarity that never fades with age. You must be Ethan, she said, extending her hand to him.
And you're Maggie.
Maggie nodded. Thank you for agreeing to see us. Janine led them inside, past framed photos of grandchildren and handmade quilts. The living room smelled faintly of cinnamon and old paper. On the coffee table was a cardboard box, worn at the corners, bound with twine. This, Janine said, lowering herself into the armchair, is everything I kept from those years. After the fire, after that boy arrived at our intake facility, I made copies of what I could. I didn't trust the system even back then.
Too much confusion.
Too many children slipping through cracks. Ethan and Maggie sat on the couch opposite her. Maggie's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. Janine untied the twine and opened the box. She pulled out a folder marked, case #403 unknown male child. I remember him, she said. We called him Jamie for weeks before anyone realized he didn't know his name. He was covered in soot, barely spoke. But he clung to that bracelet like it was his heartbeat.
Maggie's briscote.
He had a scar, Janine added, on his right hand.
Index finger.
Like he'd been cut by something sharp a few years prior. Ethan slowly turned his hand over and pointed to the faint line on his own index finger. The room went silent. Janine opened the folder. Inside were scanned intake forms, photos, and handwritten notes. One paper in particular caught Ethan's eye, a transfer form. It listed his name as Jamie, possible alias. Bracelet inscribed with MD. The transfer destination, Tanbury Children's Home, the very place he'd been told he'd come from. Wait, Ethan said, leaning forward. This says I was admitted to Tanbury under the name Jamie? Janine nodded. Yes. But someone later changed the file. Reclassified it under Ethan Carter, after adoption. New documents were created, but the original copies were left in this box. Probably by mistake. Maggie reached for the form, her fingers trembling. There's more, Janine said. She pulled out a handwritten note clipped to the intake form. It was signed by a social worker named Laura Hensley. Child may be connected to Brooklyn fire. Mother potentially deceased.
Bracelet mais belong tout, Maggie Dawson.
Notify if any survivor claims child. I remember Laura, Janine said. She was the one who linked the boy to the fire. But by the time we tried to follow up, the adoption had already gone through. The records were sealed. And no one notified Maggie. Maggie's face was pale. So all this time, he was mine. I believe so, Janine said. I can't say with legal certainty, but if we compare this intake file with your police report from the fire, the timeline, the bracelet, the scar.
It's au lire.
Ethan's chest tightened. He stared at the papers in front of him, the weight of 30 years pressing against his lungs. I need to see it, he said. Janine looked at him.
The bracelet.
The intake photo. All of it. I need to see it. She handed him a small plastic envelope. Inside was a faded photo of a boy, thin, dusty, frightened, holding something tightly in his fist. Ethan turned the photo over. On the back, in cursive handwriting, was written, Jamie, possibly Dawson, March 1995. He handed the envelope to Maggie. She stared at the image for a long time, silent tears trailing down her cheeks. I knew it, she whispered. I knew it when you picked up the charm, when you looked at me like you knew me. I knew it even when the test said otherwise. Ethan looked up. Then why didn't it match?
Janine Siged.
Because those DNA samples likely came from adoption records, not biological relatives. If they used the wrong data to compare, or if Maggie's file was never entered correctly, it would have failed. He nodded slowly.
It all made sense now.
The error wasn't in the biology, it was in the bureaucracy. You're going to need more proof if you want to open the records officially, Janine warned. But I'll write a statement.
Everything y remember. Everything y have.
I'll testify if it comes to that. Maggie reached across and squeezed her hand. Thank you. You have no idea what this means. Janine smiled. I think I do. They left with copies of the documents, hearts full of things too large to name. That night, back in New York, Ethan sat alone in his apartment. The evidence was in front of him. The pieces had finally come together. And yet, something within him resisted finality. He had lived so long not knowing. Now the knowing felt both comforting and terrifying. He stood by the window, looking out at the city. The lights of thousands of apartments twinkled in the dark, each one its own little story. For the first time, he didn't feel like a child of mystery. He felt like a man coming home to a truth that had waited patiently for 3 decades. He picked up the phone and dialed. She answered on the first ring. Maggie, he said. I think we can finally say it. She waited. I think I'm your son. There was silence on the other end, then a soft sob. Jamie, she whispered. He closed his eyes. And for the first time, when he heard that name, he didn't flinch. He smiled. Yes, Mom. Ethan stood at the edge of the small park in Brooklyn where Maggie had once sold vegetables every morning for nearly 20 years. The familiar rhythm of the market surrounded him now, vendors calling out prices, children weaving between carts, the scent of cilantro and fresh bread wafting through the air. But today was different. Today, he wasn't a curious stranger or a wandering soul seeking answers. Today he was home. Beside him, Maggie straightened her coat and smoothed back a strand of hair the wind had blown across her cheek. She was nervous. He could see it in the way her hands twisted the handle of her woven bag, even though it was empty. You don't have to do this if it feels too much, Ethan said gently. She smiled at him, eyes glistening. I've dreamed of this moment for 30 years. I can handle a few stairs. He offered his arm, and she took it. Together, They walked down the aisle of stalls, faces turning toward them with surprised recognition. Some vendors paused in mid-sale. A few whispered, not rudely, but with awe. Was that Ethan Carter? With Maggie?
A woman selling mango stepped forward. Maggie, she said softly.
Is that? Maggie nodded.
This is my son, Jamie.
The woman gasped, covering her mouth. I remember him. You always said he'd come back. Ethan reached out and shook her hand. Thank you for watching over her all these years. And just like that, the hush broke into applause, not loud or showy, but warm and sincere, the kind that travels from soul to soul rather than screen to screen. Ethan helped Maggie set up a small folding table at the end of the lane, not to sell anything, but to share coffee and pastries with the neighbors who had kept her standing all these years. The morning turned into afternoon, and stories were traded like currency, tales of the past, photos pulled from wallets, tears that needed no explanation. It was not a press event. It wasn't a corporate move. It was family. That night, back in Maggie's apartment, the two sat in silence for a long while, sipping tea. You know, she said after a while, when you were a baby, you used to hum yourself to sleep. Little off-key notes, like a bird trying to find its song. He chuckled.
Isti Dodette.
In my head. I know. I saw it in your eyes that first day. You were trying to remember a song you'd never heard clearly. Ethan's expression turned thoughtful. It's strange. All those years I felt like something was missing, like there was a door in my memory that wouldn't open. And now, I think I've opened it. Or at least, I've stopped trying to force it shut. Maggie reached across and touched his hand.
You don't have to remember everything.
Just knowing you came back is enough for me. I didn't come back, he said. I finally arrived. The following week, Ethan published an open letter, not through Arcadine's PR team, not as a marketing maneuver, but as a personal message. It ran in national newspapers, online magazines, and across his own platforms. He told the truth. About the fire. About being lost.
About Maggie.
About how love is not always tidy or proven by science, but felt in the spaces between silence and survival. The public response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from adopted children, grieving parents, foster families, and people who had spent their lives wondering where they belonged. Ethan responded to many of them personally. He began working with reform advocates, aiming to create a system where no one's past could be lost in a filing cabinet again. Arcadine didn't fall apart. In fact, it thrived. His board, initially cautious, soon realized that what Ethan had done was not damage the brand, but humanize it. For once, the tech world listened not because someone had a product, but because someone had found a purpose. And as for Maggie, she never returned to selling vegetables. Instead, she and Ethan started a small foundation in Jamie's name, offering scholarships to children who had aged out of the foster system, and microgrants to elderly caregivers struggling to make ends meet. They called it the Silver Bracelet Fund. On the foundation's opening day, Maggie stood beside Ethan at the small ceremony held in the very park where she used to sell her produce. Her silver bracelet gleamed in the sunlight. Ethan wore his as well, his own, rediscovered and restored.
Matching again.
I used to think I lost everything in that fire, Maggie said in her speech. But the truth is, the ember of love never went out. It just waited for 30 years, to light again. Ethan didn't speak long. He didn't need to. All he said was, I found my mother. And in doing that, I found myself. Later, as the crowd drifted away and the park fell quiet, Maggie turned to Ethan and said, You still hum in your sleep, you know. He laughed.
Guess some things don't change.
She slipped her arm through his. I'm glad they don't. They walked together, slowly, as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the path ahead. There were still things they would never fully know, memories that couldn't be retrieved, moments lost in smoke and time. But they had now. And now was enough.